Hello, leaders. Patrick Jinks here, leadership and strategy coach and president of the Jinks Perspective. How is your board doing through this COVID-19 crisis? I have a special treat for you on this episode. Here we go. A couple of weeks ago, April 3rd to be exact, a leading consulting firm here in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, celebrated their 17th anniversary of helping nonprofits excel. The organization is the Weathers Group, and its founder, Charles Weathers, is my guest today. Charles was one of our co-authors on a blog post we published a few weeks ago about leading a nonprofit through this pandemic we're all facing. And this April video series just would not be complete without taking advantage of Charles' expertise, particularly in the area of board governance. Charles is a speaker, a master facilitator, a conversation holder, a subject matter expert, and a good friend who quite honestly has pushed me and many others in our coaching and consulting space to greater excellence. So, with no further ado, via Zoom video conferencing, here's our conversation with Charles.
Hello, Charles. Thank you so much for joining me on this YouTube channel. I've been really excited about this. I got to tell you, it was great to have Forrest on a couple of weeks ago and Casey, and I know we've got Tom coming up, Tom Klaus coming up next week. I got to tell you, not to diminish anybody else, but I've really been looking forward to this. You are, when I came to South Carolina a little over 5 years ago now, maybe the first name I heard in terms of an influencer in the sector was yours. And at the time, actually was working fairly close. I was working in the same organization as your wife, Anita. And so I knew her, but not long after I got to South Carolina, I attended one of your sessions. It might have been a United Way session or a Together SC session, and it was on governance. And I remember walking away going, okay, now I know why I'm hearing this guy's name everywhere. He's the real deal. That was such rich content. I've never forgotten. And of course, I've seen you many times since. And I'm thrilled to be able to, for any of our viewers who might not have met you, I'm so glad they get to do that here. So thank you so much for coming on with me today.
Patrick, you are more than welcome. Thank you for the invite. And as you said, this project with you and Tom and Forrest and Casey has been phenomenal. I mean, I feel like I'm part of like an all-star team here, to be quite frank. And I'm loving this right here. The energy that we're creating around this conversation, helping nonprofits lead through the current crisis and just be better at their overall performance. I'm just glad to be a part of the equation, my friend.
Oh man, well this is great, and I think it opens up the door for us to think about other things creatively down the line. It's amazing what a crisis can do to get people to think a little bit differently and innovatively. So let's jump right into it. There's a lot of things that you and I could talk about, and a lot of perspective that you could share. I wanted to focus, if it's all right, I'd like to focus your attention on the idea of governance. In our blog post, we mentioned 5 things that sort of 5 lenses for leaders to think through during this time. And one of them was about engaging the board. Right. And I don't know of anybody else more qualified to talk about how a board operates in general. But right now, I'm really interested in your perspective on a couple things. And the first thing I'm interested in hearing you talk about, Charles, is one of the things we talk about boards through the lens of governance. There's leadership, but then there's the actual governance function of a board. How does that change during a crisis? What's the role of governance, of a governing body of a nonprofit during a time like this, in your estimation? Does it change? Is it different? What's your perspective on that?
Great question, Patrick. Here's my perspective on that. First of all, as you know me, I believe in defining important terms. And I think that, let's take the word governance, for instance. Governance can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And one of the things I think happens is, number one, we got to define, what does governance mean? What are we talking about when we say governance? Now, here's my quick definition that I use for governance. Organizational control by group leadership on the behalf of others that ensures an organization achieves what it should achieve while avoiding those behaviors and situations that should be avoided. Organizational control by group leadership on the behalf of others that ensures an organization achieves what it should achieve while avoiding those behaviors and situations that should be avoided. That definition is adapted from John Carver and Policy Governance. And I love that definition. And I think it meets up with all boards. And so if nothing else, boards still control the organization. That's the thing. We have to control it. But here's the key, not micromanage it. We're not there to manage it. And one of the best things that boards can do at this point in time, in some cases, is get out the way. And what I mean by that is don't create onerous processes for the executive director to go through right now that makes a crisis more cumbersome, so to speak. So control does not mean I have my hands on everything. That's not control. Control means I keep my finger on the pulse of the organization in this case. So as an example, I'm checking in with the ED. The ED is checking in with me. One of the biggest roles of the board right now is to listen to understand what's really going on. And here's my philosophy with that, Patrick. The board speaks with one voice. Watch it. The board speaks with one voice, but one voice does not speak for the board. And so why the ED does not need 17 people telling them what to do right now. That's not going to work. So like you do in coaching world, we're not here to tell boards what to do right now, but ask the right questions right now. So one of the biggest things a board can do right now when it comes to their role is ask the ED, what can we do right now to better support you? What do you need from us individually and collectively during this current crisis? What can we do now that we weren't doing 2 or 3 months ago? I will share this with you, then I'll pause for a second. Most boards are built around a checklist mindset. What I mean by that, there's a calendar, pretty predictable. We know when we approve the budget. We know when we do the ED's evaluation. We know when we make quorum. We know when we set the agenda. So certain things are in place. They're predictable, and we check those boxes. Guess what's happened in the last 2 months? No predictability. It's gone. So now the normal way of doing business, so to speak, has been totally disrupted. What do we do when our checklist, watch this, we don't have a checklist for a crisis? Now, some boards do, some don't. And this is the point right now where the board has to work with the ED to find out what are the things we need to be checking off and checking on to help you through this crisis.
So, Charles, actually, this is a great segue into the next question I have for you, because when you talk about that checklist, you said some boards have it and some boards don't. I'll go out on a limb and say, in my experience, most boards don't.
Yes, sir.
And you know, not to criticize any individual board, but as a sector in large is not very good at continuity planning. And now's the time when you need that, right? So here would be my question is, what are the implications on governance moving forward? How is this experience of COVID-19, how should it shape or change or improve the role of governance of a board in the long term when we're out of this crisis?
I love this question. I think that the opportunity in this crisis for governance is to totally reframe and reshape governing of nonprofit boards. Totally. I think the governance of nonprofit boards is behind the times. I think we're lagging. And I think we still govern organizations like it was 1950. Nothing wrong with 1950, but governance needs to evolve, and governance has not evolved. Leadership principles and practices have evolved. Management principles and practices have evolved. But governance seems stuck in this space of we're here to provide oversight. We're here to follow Robert's Rules of Order. We're here to meet once a month and make quorum, and that's our role. It's much deeper than that. We need governing boards that lead. We need governing boards that understand engagement. We need governing boards that recognize attending a board meeting is not engagement, because you can be there at the meeting and not be connected. Boards must recognize that the role we play is pretty much dependent upon the organization. There's a saying, Patrick, you've seen one nonprofit board, you've seen one nonprofit board. They're all not the same. You can't cut and paste practices. So what I hope comes out of this are that we take a critical look at the board work that we're doing and ask ourselves, do we really need to do it that way, and what's a better way of doing it? Let me give you a quick example. Board meetings. I've been telling people for years that the time is going to come where boards are not going to meet face-to-face. I even have clients right now where they've changed their bylaws where twice a year they meet face-to-face. Every other meeting is a Zoom call or virtual call. And people looked at me and said, Charles, we have to meet face-to-face. I said, no, you don't. No, you don't. Now, one of the drivers of that was the generational differences in the boardroom. What's happening, Patrick, and I know you know this from your work, boardrooms today have something taking place that never happened before. 5 generations in the boardroom together, volunteering and governing together. Traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and then 23-year-olds and below, that's Generation Z or the I generation. And those 5 generations are going to look at things differently, and that is going to help drive some use of technology and some other things that I think will improve board performance.
Well, I got to tell you, what you're talking about really resonates with me, and people who have watched my episodes will know this. They'll listen to you and go, wow, that sounds a lot like what I've said. And that is that for me, for a board, it's not so much about governance. You got to have the basics. You got to have all the legal stuff, but it's about leadership. And the fact that the board sees the CEO as the de facto leader, the CEO often sees the board as the manager of the leader. And boards really hire CEOs to lead them, which I think is interesting. But I agree with you. I think when the board as a body realizes it is a leadership entity as much as, if not more than, a governance entity, that's when the game will change. Am I hearing you right?
You are hearing me correctly. Let me give you an example. There's a statewide board here in South Carolina I was working with this past year, and it blew my mind, Patrick, when the ED said this to me. The ED said, I don't really care about bylaws. I mean, if the board wants to show up to a meeting, let them show up to the meeting. You know what I need from my board? The ED said, I need 3 things from my board. When I call them, I need them to answer the phone. When I come to their community, I need them to escort me into certain meetings or be an advocate for me in the space right there. And number 3, I need them to talk about our work amongst their circles of influence. If my board do those 3 things, that's what I need. He said, I have board meetings that never come to a meeting because they can't be there. He goes, and I know the governance experts would just, their skin would crawl to hear this. He says, but it doesn't matter because I don't have them there for meetings. I have them there for meaningful things outside of those meetings. And for me, I loved it.
I love it too. And I don't know that it would fit every organization, but what I love about it is that they are clear about what they need. They've defined it. I've heard you say you have to define board engagement. Yep. Again, my viewers have heard the Jinx perspective definition of board engagement, which is a measurable level of the intellectual, emotional, and physical contribution that a board consistently makes to its organization and its mission. And I'll probably have it up on the screen. I've put it up many times. That's our definition. It's like leadership. There's a number of right definitions to it, but just know what it is so that you can know when you're getting what you need from your board. So what I love about this CEO that you just referenced is that they're crystal clear about what they need. I find most boards are not disengaged because they don't want to be engaged. They're disengaged because they don't know how to be engaged, because the CEO is not clear about that path, about what they need. Is that your experience as well?
Definitely. And during a time like this, you alluded to this earlier, I see boards sitting waiting for the CEO to give them some direction. CEOs sometimes waiting for the board to give them some direction. And guess what? Everybody's just sitting there. Here's been my experience, and I know that you've been a nonprofit CEO as well. My experience has showed me this. The typical nonprofit CEO, if I were to take their week and divide it up, I would say 1/3 of their week is spent managing, 1/3 of their time managing the organization, the programs, the people, and so on. 1/3 of their week is spent outside, shaking hands, taking pictures, kissing babies, raising money, raising awareness, making connections. And 1/3 of their week, 1/3 of their time is spent managing their boards. So though technically on the org chart, you fall under the board, the truth is the typical CEO manages their board. That's not a shot at the board. That's not a negative thing toward the board. It's just the reality. And when a CEO understands they manage their board, when they understand that, then they are better able to help their board help them during a time like this.
Yeah, well said. And I think right now, because board members are volunteers and have their own crisis going on within their respective organizations, I think right now, you mentioned the board sitting around, the CEO, they're not sitting around, but they're deferring to the other body to take the initiative of leadership. Would you agree that right now the CEOs are going to have to be that? They're going to have to take the initiative and say, I've got to lead right now. My board is distracted. I've got to make the path easier than ever for them to support me. but I've got to do what I've got to do. That's what they've hired me for. Would you agree?
Now is the time for the CEO to show why they were hired. Yes, it is. And I'll tell you this, I serve on a statewide board here in South Carolina, and our CEO, what he does a phenomenal job of this. He answers our questions before we ask them. He's ahead of us. He stays ahead of the board. He's 2 and 3 steps ahead of us. We ask a question, he's like, here it is, there it is. What we've done as an example is we meet normally every other month. We've now gone to Zoom where we meet monthly, but also there's a weekly check-in call for anybody who just wants to get on the phone for 30 minutes to get an update on what's happening in real time. So he's answering questions. He's being proactive. The fact of the matter is that oftentimes he knows the answer to the question, but he'll ask us anyway because he understands the role of the board. He understands our role of approving and supporting what he does. So though he's ahead of us, he doesn't present it like he's over us. And there's a fine dance that he does there. And let me be clear, this is not a rubber stamp board. We're not just doing whatever the CEO says. We ask questions. We want to be engaged. We want to make sure we're making prudent decisions. However, the CEO is definitely leading right now.
It's a great example. Let me shift gears because you mentioned a minute ago about how boards can support the CEO. And you mentioned this one CEO who is very clear about 3 things they need. Generally speaking, though, in a time like this, what do you think are 2 or 3 things that a board can be doing to support the CEO proactively right now?
I think one of the first things a board can do to support the CEO right now is to trust the CEO. And when I talk about trust, I'm talking about having confidence in them. The last thing the CEO needs right now is a board or board members who are second guessing them. It's already stressful. We're already in a crisis. We don't need to be second guessed. CEOs need to work in a high trust environment with their board. Doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. Doesn't mean they're going to always get it right. But they must recognize they're going to make a mistake or they might take some risk, and they have to know that the board has their back. If you're fighting the crisis and fighting your board right now, that makes life unbearable. So boards, please trust your CEO, have confidence in them, and be there for them. The second thing I think that boards can do for the CEOs right now is that they can be accessible for them. Again, you said earlier, Patrick, board members are distracted. They have things going on. They have other boards or their companies and their families, understandably so. But every now and then, carve out a slice of time throughout the month, throughout the week, just to check in on the CEO, let them know you're here. Just let them have access to you every now and then. I think that's extremely, extremely helpful for them. And the other thing I think that the way the board can support the CEO during a time like this, and this is a big one in my world, boards have circles of influence. Boards have relationships. And you and I both know relationships matter. And the board member may not have all the answers, or the board member may not be able to make the connection, but help leverage your relationships on the behalf of the organization. I know a nonprofit in another state that was having some challenges applying for some of the federal grant money for payroll and things of that nature. And they had a board member who had a relationship with a firm that was doing some work in that area, and the board member made the connection, and the CEO was so thankful because the CEO could not get through that layer or that barrier, but that relational connection was a need they had, and that was support for the CEO.
You know, it's funny, Charles. Last week, Casey was giving, she went through some tips on communication, and as I was listening to them, I was realizing those are things we ought to keep in mind all the time, not just during a crisis. I sat there and thought the same thing about the 3 things you just mentioned, about trusting your CEO, reaching out to your CEO periodically, leveraging those relationships. Those are things we should always be doing. But what I hear you saying, and I just think it's important to note, is right now is when particularly those 3 things can make such a big difference. So the appropriateness of them doesn't change, but the impact of them changes right now because of the situation we're in.
The thing I love about the way you framed that, Patrick, none of this is new. None of this, we're not giving the board new duties right now. We're not asking to solve new problems. It's simply take what you've already been doing and just go a little bit deeper, a little bit more intensity. That's all we're talking about. And let me share one thing with you before I forget when it comes to support for the CEO. I think the CEO needs a space where they can take their cape off. What I mean by that, CEOs are bearing some big burdens right now, Patrick. Their shoulders are big. They're carrying a lot. Their families, their employees, their team members, other volunteers, clients they serve, partners. CEOs are bearing a weight right now. And it's hard for the leader to find that space to take their cape off and take the S off their chest and say, can I just be human for a moment? Can I be vulnerable for a moment? Boards, please give your CEO the space to come in that room, whether it's in Zoom or whatever, and just not have all the answers for a moment, not fix everything for a moment. Give them a space just to breathe and say, it's been a tough one, but I'll get back up. They need that, Patrick.
They do. And what a gift for a board to give that space to the CEO. That's powerful. What should a board not be doing right now? Are there any sort of don'ts, like, and again, I know we both probably sound a little bit like, we're these hyper critique on board members. These are wonderful volunteers that have dedicated time and service to an organization. But again, they've got a lot on their plates too. What are some tips you would give them as some things to avoid right now as a board?
Absolutely. I'll share a couple with you. And I want to reiterate what you just said. This is not board bashing by any stretch of the imagination. You and I have both worked for boards, worked with boards, and served on boards. And we honor and appreciate everything that board members do. This is just a way to sharpen the saw of board members.
Absolutely.
So a couple things I recommend board members do not do, or boards do not do. Number one, do not cut and paste strategies. Do not cut and paste strategies or approaches. What do I mean? In a time like this, it's easy to benchmark what somebody's doing in another city, another state, another industry, another location, and say, let's do that here, it'll work here. Can't cut and paste it. You just cannot. You might be able to learn from it, but cutting and pasting strategies during any time doesn't work. I know you know that, Patrick. But during a crisis, it definitely does not work, because there are other factors that we're just not considering. So don't think because it works in that county, it's going to definitely work here, just as an example.
Yeah, we use that in terms of best practices. The term best practices is one we just have to be so careful of, because a best practice in my experience is somebody did something and came up with an idea that they liked, and maybe it worked well in their organization, so they published it or marketed it as a best practice. Maybe someone else even marketed it for them as a best practice. Therefore, we think we should employ that practice, and that's not necessarily the case.
Absolutely. Good point. And then also what I'm going to ask the board to do as well is to avoid creating unnecessary barriers for the CEO and for the team. What do I mean by this? This is a time where efficiencies matter. I mean, not only are we doing more with less, I mean, we have to really leverage what we have. And the last thing we need is another hoop to jump through. We need I call it jokingly the permission-based relationship. If your board and CEO have a permission-based relationship where the CEO has to run back to the board to ask permission every time they make a move, you're not going to be as high performing as you need to be right now. Give the CEO some margin to get the work done and not have to keep running back, jumping through hoops to make decisions that should be within their authority. Please don't do that.
Yeah, that goes back to trust that you mentioned a while ago. And
yes, it does.
Just hearing you say that made me think of, I know you're familiar with this, The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. And he, in that book, he articulates a formula for trust, which is when trust is high, cost is lower, and speed is faster.
That's right.
When trust is low, cost goes up and speed goes down. Right now, with the things that we've got to accomplish in a quick period of time, we need that high speed and probably need the low cost right now, because now we're all looking at our long-term financial futures, and nonprofits are no exception to that. So it just goes straight back to trust your CEO and vice versa.
That's right. One of my favorite books, as a matter of fact. And the other thing I'll say, Patrick, when in terms of what the board should not do right now, do not leave your CEO hanging. And I know that's a little slang term, so to speak, but what I mean by this, there's some tough decisions to be made right now. From employment to benefits to support, all types of things. And the CEO is going to be at the front of a lot of these decisions, obviously. Board members need to be standing side by side with CEO. Maybe not physically, but virtually, emotionally, and just quite frankly, reputationally. Don't let the CEO sit out here and make these tough decisions, and then the board takes a pass. Well, we didn't want to do that. You got to be on the same page, be on one accord. That's what I'm talking about. It's very, very important that all these tough decisions have the board's buy-in. Do not abandon your CEO and leave them hanging to dry.
Wow. Fantastic. Man, our viewers are getting like a conference right now. This is incredible. I do want to wrap this up and be sensitive to your time, Charles. Let me just ask you this final question. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers who are mostly nonprofit CEOs, some board members and others? But anything you'd like to share, a perspective that you think is important to get out there that my questions didn't give you a chance to say?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think that we all want results. And I think results, the pathway to results are relationships. I think at this time, relationships matter more than ever before. Yes, strategy does matter. Yes, leadership does matter. But relationships, the network of people, the connectivity of people, they matter. And though we are physical distancing, we don't have to be relationally distancing. Now is a time more than ever before for us to connect, for us to convene, for us to stay on one page. No one can do this in a silo. The one thing we know for sure during this time, we all need each other. And here's my last point. I do a lot of work in the world of systems thinking. And from a systems perspective, all these interrelated parts and elements, they cannot work by themselves. So we can't talk about governance alone if we don't talk about programming and budgeting and all the other factors as well. Recognize how things connect. And we understand the connectivity, we work better together. We're all on the same team. Great work.
Fantastic. I've heard you talk about the word relationships, I think, in about every gathering I've ever been with you, and you live it. And I appreciate our relationship, and I appreciate the relationship you have with this state and this sector. I know a lot of our viewers are not in South Carolina, but we're centered here, and we spend a lot of time here with these organizations. And just thank you again, Charles, for, by the way, happy 17th anniversary. April 3rd, I think, was your anniversary date for the Weathers Group. Just that's a long time making an impact in this sector, and it continues to grow. And I'm honored to be a part of this with you. And just want to thank you again for all that you do and for coming on the show today.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you so much. And thanks for being part of the team. And thanks for being in my life and in my circle. You make me stronger.
Back at you. We'll see you soon, Charles.
All right, brother. Take care. Bye-bye.
Can't do it any better than that. I've placed a link to Charles' website in the video description below, and I hope you'll check it out. Thanks again, Charles, for your work and for your sharing your time and talent with us here on this channel. That's the Jinx Perspective for this week. Our series continues with another special guest next week, so don't miss that. In the meantime, as always, if you'd like to explore ways that the Jinx Perspective can help you and your organization achieve greater clarity, simplicity, and alignment in your mission work, reach out and schedule a free discovery call with me by clicking the link that's also in the video description below. And as always, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this video channel and click the bell icon next to the subscribe button so that you're notified when we drop new episodes. And please, think of a friend or a colleague who you think might benefit from these episodes and share it with them. See you here next time.